adopted with my birth mother in 2010, and then I met her in 2011. My story is pretty typical of kind of my generation of adoptees. I was adopted in the 1980s, which was, as you guys recall, the kind of the peak of international adoption from Korea. And my birth mother and my birth father had actually known each other since elementary school. They went to the same elementary school, and they grew up in this little town that was, kind of a rural farming town. And then when they graduated from high school, they moved to Busan, which is a port city. My mother went to earn money for her family. She was the eldest of 5 siblings, and my birth father went to college. And they were in a relationship for 9 years before my birth mother got pregnant, and they weren't married. My birth mother, my birth father assumed that they would start a family together because they'd been together for 9 years as a couple, and they had known each other since elementary school. But my birth father's family was really against it because they wanted him to continue to pursue his education. As you recall, kind of education was a way for Koreans to kind of gain social mobility and upward mobility at that point in time. And so they were really against them starting a family at that point in time, and so they pressured my birth mother into giving me up for adoption. So I was adopted when I was relinquished at birth. I was adopted to Michigan when I was 5 months old, and then it took me 26, 27 years to reunite with her. And that's kind of when I learned kind of the whole story. My story is, after going through my records and then listening to her side of the story, it matched up pretty well. So my case wasn't necessarily like Deanne's, where there was a lot of ambiguity about what really happened, but I know a lot of adoptees that have similar experiences to Deanne's, where a lot of the paperwork is forged, a lot of their story ends up being completely not true. Other questions? Yeah.
Did you end up meeting your birth father too then? Or?
I haven't. My birth mother says that she has his contact information, but she won't give it to me. I know that even 30 plus years later, it's still really raw for her. She ended up remarrying, and she has 2 daughters with her husband. She's happy, but it's a time of her life that was really, really traumatic for her. She almost committed suicide, and so I think kind of revisiting that is really hard for her, and allowing me to kind of establish a relationship is really hard for her. And for me, I haven't pushed the issue because I really value my relationship with my birth mother, and if she's not ready for that, then I'm okay with that, and I'm willing to kind of go at her pace. So I haven't. I have heard that he ended up marrying and having 2 sons, and he lives in Pohang. But yeah, other than that, I haven't don't have a lot of information about it.
How do you communicate with your birth mother?
Yeah, so my Korean is very beginner. I would say maybe I'm an advanced beginner. I know enough to get around and ask basic questions and stuff. She doesn't know any English. Fortuitously, her eldest daughter, who is just 14 months younger than I am, is fluent in English. And so, kind of when we first reunited, we're having difficulties communicating with each other without a translator. And then so it was kind of her decision then to kind of bring my sister in onto the secret, so that she was able to help us kind of communicate. So my sister Kayang has kind of acted as a translator for us for quite some time. Last year when I visited Korea, my younger sister, Kayang told my younger sister, and that ended up kind of being a little bit of a disaster. But her husband doesn't know about me, so when I visit, there always has to be kind of this excuse, she's going to Seoul to visit a sister or something in order to visit me. But
what do you mean by her husband? I mean, your mother's husband?
My mother's husband, yeah, who's not my biological father.
Were your adoptive parents supportive of you finding your birth parents?
Yeah, they were. I grew up in a very conservative, very rural, very white community, but my parents were kind of the only liberals in town. They've been really supportive of kind of my journey through my adoption identity and my search for my birth parents. They've been really supportive throughout. I have my youngest brother as well. I come from a fairly big adoptive family. I'm the eldest, and then I have a sister who's the biological child of my parents, and a brother who's the biological child, and then my youngest brother is also a Korean adoptee, who's not biologically related to me. My youngest brother did a birth search as well and ended up finding his family a couple years ago, and they've been really supportive. My whole family's been really supportive of it throughout the whole process.
So in the documentary, do you remember when Lynn said that only when she moved the space that she occupied, she really had to confront the questions that she maybe had built up over the years, but not necessarily listened to?
Mm-hmm.
Is there maybe space or literature or some sort of space or tools that really triggered your intention in figuring out what's left behind?
The MA program here in Asian American Studies was kind of my saving grace. I graduated from University of Michigan, and I had a degree in English literature and environmental studies. I took maybe one Asian American literature class when I was in undergrad, and I applied to the MA program here at SF State in Asian American Studies. Not necessarily as a career path, but more as kind of I need to figure stuff out about myself. And so the MA program actually ended up being kind of a journey of self-exploration and self-discovery for me, and that really kind of triggered my Asian American identity, my Korean American identity, my adoptee identity, in a good way. So and that the program really kind of opened my eyes to language and concepts that I wasn't aware of, that I had been experiencing, and finally was able to understand and elaborate on in kind of with the language and concepts I was given through the program. So you guys are lucky. You're getting this kind of as undergrads and kind of being able to explore your minority identities or alternate identities much earlier than I did. So, other questions?
Did you have any trouble adjusting, feeling different than how the rest of your family looked, or just the people around you?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I grew up in a very conservative, very white, very Christian community, where if you weren't the right kind of Christian, you were going straight to hell. There wasn't. I wouldn't say there was a lot of latent racism that you would think of. People didn't call me chink. People didn't spit in my face and stuff. But there was definitely I was made to feel an outsider, unintentionally or not. And so that it weighs down on you. Those microaggressions. They build up over time. My family, like I said, was really supportive, so I didn't feel any, microaggressions or anything from them. But at the same time, my parents are white people living in a white dominant world, and so kind of the things that I was experiencing, they were sympathetic to, but really couldn't understand, and they weren't necessarily equipped to fully help me process that in ways that perhaps a parent who looked more like myself might have been able to. Other questions?
What do your adoptive parents do?
My adoptive parents, my mother is a children's librarian, and my adoptive father is an environmental attorney.
Do they still live in Michigan?
They do. Yeah, most of my family still lives in Michigan. Actually, all of my family know. My sister lived in Chicago for a while, but she moved back home to start a family. So I'm not inclined to move back to Michigan I really like it here in San Francisco, so trying to ensure that I can stay here in the Bay Area.
Like the feelings that you have for your adoptive parents, how would you like equate that to the feelings you have for your birth father?
It's completely different. I mean, I love them both dearly. My relationship with my birth mother, I think both of us kind of went into it without expectations or assumptions about our roles in regards to one another, which I think was actually a really good move on both our parts. I think a lot of adoptees go into reunions assuming that if they find their birth parents, it'll magically solve everything in their world, right? And they have these kind of assumptions about their birth families. You know, if you find them, then everyone lives happily ever after. But the reality is there are a lot of barriers. There's a language barrier, there's a cultural barrier, there's a barrier of living on the other side of the world, the barrier of time, 30 years or whatever, of being separated. And so, I think both of us, my birth mother and I, went into the relationship acknowledging that although she's my birth mother and I'm her daughter, we don't have the typical mother-daughter relationship, right? And so we don't expect kind of the typical mother-daughter reciprocal relationship expectations from each other. We obviously love each other very much and are fairly close, but I think we both are, don't expect too much of one another, or I don't know if that makes sense. So yeah, my relationship with my birth mother is definitely a different parental-child relationship than I have with my adoptive family, who I've been with for my entire life. Yeah.
When did you first start pursuing to find your birth mother, and how long did that take that?
My search actually was really, really fast, which was actually really surprising to me. So I started searching in 2009, and like 6 or 9 months later, I was exchanging emails with my birth mother. And I went through my adoption agency, and they actually had her registration information, and they were able to trace where her current address and contact information were. For a lot of adoptees, that's not the case. Either papers have been forged, they go missing. I know about 10 adoptees whose paperwork was apparently lost in a fire at their orphanage, who knew that there were so many fires at orphanages that would destroy only papers and not the buildings or the children. There are a lot of excuses. So like I said, I was pretty fortunate that kind of my records were fairly accurate and that they still had them and that they were willing to kind of pursue that for me. So yeah, my knowing all that and actually being kind of a scholar of adoption studies and kind of studying people's search experiences, I was ready to go into my own search kind of with guns blazing. I know how uncooperative adoption agencies can be when they're trying to kind of cover something up or to hide something, or if they're not willing to acknowledge kind of past misdeeds. But the caseworker that I was assigned actually was really empathetic, and we kind of connected on a personal level, which I think kind of benefited my cause, and she was able to kind of pull some strings and fast track some stuff for me. So yeah, my birth search was fairly quick and easy and fairly painless. So.
What about your little brother who you said was adopted? Was his?
His was a little bit trickier. His kind of situation for being relinquished was different than mine. His parents were married, had a farm together. He has 3 older brothers, so he came into an established family, but their kind of economic economic situation at that time was not ideal, and so kind of raising another son at that point in time was going to be difficult. We found out actually though when he reunited that was the story that was told to us through the adoption agency. When he reunited, we kind of found out that actually that story was a little bit inaccurate. His birth father actually told us that my brother was born like a month early and had a few complications when he was born. He like swallowed amniotic fluid and like had to be in an incubator for a while. And so the hospital bills were going to be really expensive. And we were told that he was going around the hospital asking, who do I talk to give up this child for adoption? When he reunited, he actually, his birth father told us that he was actually approached by somebody. He didn't have this idea of relinquishing until somebody approached him and said, you know, if you give this baby to us that we can put up for adoption, we'll take care of all of your hospital bills. So, so his story is a little bit, I don't know. I don't think necessarily there was like, you know, nefarious baby stealing going on, but there's definitely some coercion, some kind of manipulation involved there. We tried to go through his adoption agency, and they were kind of like, he went through a different adoption agency than I did, and they kind of were dragging their feet and kind of did the kind of rudimentary search, but didn't put a lot of effort into it. So he went through Sergeant Lee, who, if you guys recall from the documentary, he was helping Deanne try and find Chazaki. So he's actually a police officer who has kind of dedicated his life to help adoptees reunite with their birth families. So he's helped hundreds of adoptees find their birth families. He was able to find my brother's family, and then they reunited a couple years ago. His brothers had no idea that he existed, which I think it's kind of hard to believe that like his oldest brother was like 9 when my brother was born. And you would think at that point in time, like, you would kind of understand the birds and the bees and, like, notice that your mother was, like, pregnant. But apparently, like, no one knew about him, and they didn't talk about him, you know. So it was kind of it was a surprise for his brothers when they reunited as well. But he's close with his family, too, and they, you know, they talk in Kakao all the time, so, which is the way that I communicate with my birth family as well. Yes?
Do you feel close enough to your birth family where, like I don't know, like big family occasions, like do you think you would go to like a wedding of one of your sisters, or they would come here for something?
My sister actually came to my wedding here in San Francisco when I got married. I have been fortunate to meet some of my extended family. When my birth mother was pregnant with me, it wasn't necessarily a secret in her family. She has 4 sisters and a younger brother, and so her parents knew about the pregnancy and everything. And actually, you know, her father actually tried to persuade my birth father's parents to allow the marriage to happen and stuff. But so I wasn't a secret in the family. So my aunts knew about me. My grandmother's sisters, my great aunts, knew about me. One of my great aunts actually wanted to adopt me, but just the financials at the point in time didn't allow her to you know, kind of keep me in the family. So my aunts and my grandmother and my grandmother's sisters were really supportive of my birth mother at the time and kind of following my adoption. So I wasn't a secret then, and I think they continued to be a support to her, you know, kind of throughout her life before we reunited. So I've actually had the opportunity to meet a lot of my aunts and my grandmother and my grandmother's sisters and a lot of the women who really supported my birth mother kind of through that time. Their spouses, however, and kind of the family members after that generation don't know about me. So like my aunts' husbands don't know about me, most of my cousins don't know about me. like I said, my mother's husband doesn't know about me. My sister, my younger sister didn't know about me until about a year and a half ago. So, like for big family functions like a wedding or something, I think it would kind of depend on whether my birth mother was ready to kind of make that out in the open. I actually met my youngest sister a couple times before she knew I was her sister, and I was presented as a friend of Kai Young's from America. So I actually, kind of got to know my youngest sister before she knew that we were sisters. And my Kai Young, the older sister, told me that like Chi Young, the younger sister, kind of after we met a couple times, was like, she looks really familiar, and I can't put my finger on like who she looks like, but she's really familiar. And we actually kind of look quite a bit alike, so it was kind of funny that it like ended up working out that way. My birth mother has said that at some point in time she's going to tell her husband, but like I said, I'm not pushing the subject. I'm going to wait for her to feel like it's the right time. And it's not necessarily that she's ashamed of me, but the way that she puts it is that when she got married, it was essentially an arranged marriage. She liked her husband, but wasn't necessarily madly in love with him. She got married, I think, 3 months after I was born, so it was pretty much kind of like a rebound thing. Her father really pushed her to get married and kind of start her life over in order to kind of save her life, because she was really kind of stuck in this depression after my birth. But her husband is a really good man, and kind of went into this marriage not knowing any of this history, but she ended up falling in love with him and starting a family with him, and has been with him for 30 plus years, has 2 daughters with him. So it's more that I think she's afraid of hurting him than she is ashamed of me or worried that he'll want a divorce because of this big secret. It's just trying to protect him from being hurt more than anything. So, like I said, I'm willing to kind of let her figure out when the right time for that is. Yeah.
When was it revealed that you were adopted, and how did you take that?
So like I said, my family is white. My parents are white. So it wasn't like, when I was 18, they sat me down. It was like, you may have noticed that you don't look like us. It was, my identity as an adoptee or was never a secret. It was always, talked about in my family as, we didn't come from, you weren't born from your mom, but, you're still part of our family, kind of that general narrative. Yeah, so like I said, it wasn't a secret, it was talked about, it was acknowledged in a positive way.
But when you noticed that when you were a baby, you didn't know.
Right. I think I would argue that, there are pros and cons to adoption, which I think you guys kind of were able to kind of see some of the darker side of adoption from what we've talked about and the documentary. But at the same time, it's a way that families are able to form out of non-traditional means as well. So there are pros and cons to adoption, kind of all across the board. And I firmly argue that for everything that someone gains from adoption, there's always loss, there's always trauma, and that needs to be recognized. And so I think I always felt that trauma. My adoptive mother talks about like when I was 2 years old, I would go through like these crying jugs, where I just cry inconsolably and like couldn't tell them what was wrong. And so my mom actually like gave me a marker and told me, can you draw how you feel? Can you explain to me through an image how you feel, because you don't have the words for it because you're 2 years old. And she told me I took a black marker and just drew a giant hole on a piece of paper, a giant black hole. And I think that's really kind of indicative of kind of a lot of the loss and the trauma that adoptees experience, even if they don't necessarily have the words to talk about it, or even are necessarily aware that, you know, adoption is the source of that pain.
So
But
you are sensing something not right,
yeah,
even though
At-
not
at a very
adopting,
early
or
age.
you don't know the word or anything.
right, yeah. Which I think is important to acknowledge, that, you know, even in, you know, I had pretty much the fairy tale happy adoption story. You know, a lot of adoptees are adopted or placed into families where that's not necessarily the case, where they're abused, neglected, returned, sexually abused. I was fortunate enough to kind of land in a really ideal family, but I still had that sadness, that grief inside me, and so, like I said, I think it's really important to acknowledge that even in the most ideal situations, it's still, you know, it's still complicated. Yeah.
Would you consider adoption an option?
I would not. I'm not necessarily, there are a lot of adoptees who are very anti-adoption, who want to end all adoption, period. I'm not necessarily in that camp, but I know enough about the adoption industry that it's not something that I want to support, even if, kind of like in my own case, everything goes through the right channels and everything is kind of above board. It's still not necessarily an industry that I want to support and put my money and time and effort into. But that's just my, you know.
So how would adoption be processed? Like, if it wasn't through the industry, like, what's the moral way to adopt a kid?
I mean, it goes through the adoption agencies. I mean, there are always like kind of under the table adoptions. There are a lot of stories. There was a story on, I think, CNN actually just like last week about an adoptee in Rwanda who was basically stolen from her mother. And then when the child was old enough or learned enough English to communicate, kind of like Deanne's story, like told her parents that, like, I'm not actually an orphan, I have a mother and a family back home. And so that family actually made the decision to send her back to her birth mother, which is really remarkable. So the adoption agencies, I mean, they don't do anything illegal. They make sure to dot their I's and cross their T's, but the ways in which children are acquired for adoption, there are questionable practices. They establish kind of maternity homes for single mothers who didn't have anywhere else to go, but kind of they were presented with their options, which was, well, give your child up for adoption. They weren't presented with information about keeping their child, about, you know, welfare programs for single mothers. It was just kind of assumed if you went to this support center, which was kind of the only support center of its kind in Korea, that in doing so you were agreeing to give your child up for adoption. And like in my brother's case, it was kind of, you know, someone kind of said, if you relinquish your child, we'll take care of your medical bills. A lot of the kind of information that birth mothers were given to was, you know, not necessarily full truth. It wasn't necessarily a lie, but it wasn't a full truth. A lot of the birth mothers were told, like, once you relinquish your child, don't ever come back. Don't come back asking for information. You know, that's a chapter of your life that you're done with. Don't ask questions. Don't come back. Don't revisit it. But then when the adoptees came back to the agency looking for information on the file, they were told, well, we can't reconnect you unless your birth mother makes an inquiry, and they haven't made an inquiry. They haven't come to us asking for information. So that means that they're not interested in reuniting with you. So two sides were told different stories that weren't necessarily lies, but wasn't necessarily the truth, so that those modes of communication weren't ever connected.
Been able to grow up with your birth mother and stayed in Korea?
Not necessarily. I don't regret my adoption, but at the same time, I'm critical of the adoption practices. Like I said, it's complicated. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, there's a lot of gray area. I will be the first to admit that, there are a lot of benefits and privileges that I received as an adult, or being raised in, an upper middle class white family. I probably had a lot more benefits and opportunities than I would have as a child of a single mother in Korea. But at the same time, like I said, that doesn't necessarily cancel out the losses and the costs as well. So, yeah.
Are you stable as who you are right now?
I would say yes. It took me a long time to get there, but at this point in time, I'm fairly content with kind of who I see myself as and my identity and my relationships with my various family circles.
What about your incline to Korea or America or between?
It's I think again that's kind of like a binary that is maybe I wouldn't call it a false binary, but I think there's this gray area, and I think I'm in the past 5-10 years, as a lot of the Korean adoptees from the 1980s have become adults and have kind of figured out their own identities. There's been a growth of a Korean adoptee identity that's not necessarily American, that's not Korean, but something, a third identity, a third kind of community as a Korean adoptee community, which takes from both, but is not necessarily kind of a mixture of both. It's something in and of itself. And so that's, I think, the way that I would, these days, classify my identity and where I kind of identify my community as the Korean adoptee identity and community. That's not necessarily American, not necessarily Korean, not necessarily a combination of both, but takes from both.
Once you established your bio mom and your adopted mom, or like, was there a big relief, or was it just kind of like, oh, like that's it?
It was a relief in that there were a lot of questions that I had throughout my entire life that I didn't ever think I was going to have answers to. I was very conscientious of when I started my search that I felt like I needed to be in a stable and good place in my own life before I started the search, because the search itself could have gone in a number of different ways, right? Mine was kind of like the ideal ending, right? I found my birth mother, I established a relationship with her, we continue to have contact, et cetera, right? It could have gone a different way. I could have found absolutely nothing at all. I could have found her information but found that she had died. I could have found that I could have established contact with her, but then she may have kind of rejected me and not wanted to have contact. There are a lot of different scenarios that could have gone on, and I felt like I needed to be in a place in my life where I would be okay with any of those scenarios before I started the search. Like I said, a lot of adoptees go into search kind of hoping that it's the be-all, end-all answer to everything. And I think a lot of adoptees go into the search with something very broken in them and hoping that the search will fix something in them, and when it doesn't quite go the way that they fantasized about their entire life, sometimes that can kind of trigger a downward spiral, or not be a therapeutic or positive experience for them in the long run. So for me, I made a point of not searching until I felt like I was ready for any of those answers. And so being kind of in a stable frame of mind at that point in time, I wouldn't say it was like, a giant relief, or it wasn't this like, puzzle piece that kind of fit into my life and answered all these questions, but at the same time it was definitely, it was wonderful to have a lot of my questions answered and to establish this new relationship with my birth mother and kind of learn about my birth family and everything. Yeah, like I said, it's complicated though. Okay, one more question session, and then we're gonna switch gears so we have time to go through third wave.
How did you come across the master's program here?
The what?
Master's program here in San Francisco?
Oh, to be honest, it was the only program that didn't require a GRE. And so I kind of applied kind of on a whim, like, well, I'll apply, see if I get in. If not, then I'll like study for the GRE and you know, then apply to a bunch of grad schools then. But I ended up getting in. My husband, my now husband, was in a grad program here in the Bay Area at Stanford, so it was a good way for me to be able to come over to California to be with him. So yeah, it ended up working out, but it was kind of not necessarily I didn't know any of SF State's history as being kind of the first ethnic studies, Asian American studies program in the country, none of that kind of, strike history, but it was more about like, well, I don't have to take GRE, so I guess I'll apply. Okay, we're gonna switch to